On Ticker, this is Import Export with Lawrence Christophels.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thanks for joining us on Import Export on Ticker. I'm your host, Lawrence Christophels. We've got a fantastic lineup for you today. There's so many things going on with international trade and world news. We've got some great guests. Firstly, we're going to be joined by Jason Collins, who's the CEO of the Australian European Business Council. Then we've got Ivan Tanjo, who's the CEO of Navanti Holdings, talking all things Indonesia. So many things happening in that space as well. And finally, we'll be joined by Kevin from LendCap, and we'll be talking about a whole range of important, I should say, can't get the words out, on your cash flow and finance and how to make the most out of that for importing and exporting. So we're really privileged to have Jason join us from his office in Sydney. So without further ado, I'm going to say hi, Jason, and welcome to Import Export.
Good morning, Lawrence. It's good to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you for joining us. And I know it's I've just returned from Sydney yesterday, so we didn't align, but thanks for joining us. And there's so much to talk about with EU. Obviously, the first one that most people think about at the moment is how's the Brexit going? How any things have evolved there since a few weeks ago. We had David McCready on from the Australia British Chamber of Commerce on our very first show 3 weeks ago. And it's great to have yourself on, maybe with a bit of an update on how that has progressed.
Sure. Look, David's a great colleague and will continue to be so, notwithstanding the obviously quite huge events that have happened in terms of Europe. That'll be ongoing, of course, as the UK and the EU tough it out in terms of the negotiations on their future relationship. But look, for Australians, it's actually mostly good news when we look at the whole Europe picture. If we count the UK as geographically still part of Europe, as in fact Boris Johnson has said, they're leaving the EU but not Europe. Because the amount of business flows that are happening between Europe and Australia really are unprecedented. And yes, surely the way that the EU operates and the UK operates is critically important. And what we want to do is to see that both the negotiations currently underway between Australia and the EU, now 27 member countries, and still Australia's third largest trading partner when we take the UK out of the picture, that those negotiations continue, that we conclude an ambitious deal with them, but then also we get on to doing one with the UK as well.
Yeah. I was going to ask about that. I know that there's been several rounds with the FTA between Australia and EU. How's that progressing? Where are we at with that?
Sure. Look, the negotiators from Brussels were in Canberra just last week. That was the 6th round of negotiations. So really, by any standard, these negotiations are going really at lightning speed. Why I say that is because normally you would have a negotiation with such a complex economy as the EU is. It's not just a country we're dealing with, it's actually 27 countries, but all who have agreed to vet in Brussels the powers to negotiate agreements on their behalf. So these negotiations have been going since July, or when they were launched in July 2018, and are already made very significant progress. So we're hoping for a sort of 3-year or thereabout timeframe for concluding. Most negotiations of these type you'd be looking at 6-7 years. In some cases, it's been 20 years that negotiations have gone on for.
Great. So when you say 3 years, is that from when it commenced in 2018? So 2021 is what we're sort of aiming for, or is that 3 years from now?
Yeah, look, the political leadership on both sides have said 2020 would be ideal. That is ambitious, but certainly would be aiming for 2021 if that can't be achieved by the end of this year. As I said, it is a comprehensive agreement. So it's not just a matter of tweaking some tariff schedules or tweaking some things that can be quite easily, if you like, done. It involves going to things like e-commerce, services, a whole range of regulatory issues of people-to-people movement, and so on. So it's incredibly detailed, incredibly complex. There's over 1,000 pages of text in terms of what needs to be negotiated. So it's complicated, but at the same time, we know that both negotiating teams are working incredibly hard to get through this deal as soon as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Jason, from what I understand, across some other free trade agreements that have been negotiated recently or even updated recently, with the changing landscape of e-commerce, data security, even things like geographical provenance, there's so many more complex issues to be nutted out, especially, as you say, with 27 countries. I think the 3-year plan is mind-boggling when you think about how complex those type of issues can be across several borders, and especially when you think of things like geographical provenance and how countries, especially within Europe, are really making it necessary to protect those regional brands, so to speak, around the world, and Australians have to make sure that we understand that landscape going forward.
Sure, absolutely. And you've just touched off on one of the more of the complex or sensitive issues in these negotiations, and that is that European producers, particularly rural and regional communities that produce certain foodstuffs, are keen to make sure that the sort of the products, but also the cultural history that they've had with those products over generations, centuries even, are protected. One of the things we point out to European colleagues is, in fact, it's that very heritage which has migrated to Australia. This isn't a counterfeiting type thing that's going on. It's really the migrant communities from Europe have come to Australia and started producing those very same products. But we shouldn't get too carried away by that, because the EU have negotiated agreements with Canada, where there was very similar issues at play, with Japan and with other countries where they've found solutions. And we should also bear in mind that there's a lot of disinformation out there. The EU is not seeking to ban pizza, I've even heard, because it's from Pisa. I mean, it's ridiculous. Of course, that's not on the agenda. But it's not even, say, a cheese like Camembert, but it is where it comes, if it's Camembert de Normandie, where it says it's from Normandy. Well, obviously we don't make Camembert from Normandy in Australia. Yeah. And so that's what's in focus, not trying to ban the entire cheese name as it stands.
Yeah, and I think that's where your organisation, Jason, is so valuable, because, as you say, people hear, let's say some whispers around the industry and so forth, and everyone gets a bit panicky and fearful. And it's so valuable to have a group like yours that they can actually go to get the right, accurate information, because a lot of small businesses, especially when you're trying to export, we had a fantastic exporter here on our show last week in Melbourne. He's already in 15 countries with some small good products. Now, if he were to hear that and think, okay, well, now what do I do with my branding and so forth? Not that would have any immediate impact from the brand names that he's got, but those are the sort of things that may potentially deter or demotivate some people going into the EU, where they really need to get the facts right.
Sure, and look, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the EU, as it stands without the UK, is still around about a 440 million consumer market. That's huge. It's bigger than the US. It's bigger than, and it's, relatively speaking, a high spending economy. So that means that there's enormous appetite for high quality consumer goods. Just look at the success of Australian wine that is imported in massive quantities to Europe, and that's been a fantastic success story. We were talking about geographical indicators before. Well, in South Australia, before a wine agreement between Australia and the EU was settled about 2 decades ago, Australia used to produce South Australian Rhine Riesling. Now, as part of this deal that was settled on wine, that Rhine Riesling was phased out. And what do we have now? We have Clare Valley Riesling. Well, everybody knows, not only in Australia, but now increasingly all around the world, of the great quality and characteristics of Clare Valley Riesling. And that's a great example of where this can be a win-win.
Yeah, and I think that gives that local area, as you say, global branding, global acknowledgement, which also helps with their inbound tourism and all the other producers and other services within those regions as well. So it's an important part. Jason, can I ask, you touched on wine. I mean, I think wine is a fairly well recognised success story into the EU. Are there any other emerging industries coming from Australia into the EU, things that are on the landscape where we should be looking to, what sectors should be looking out for?
Sure. Look, a number of the sectors in Australia that have been real drivers of the increased European presence in Australia have been in areas such as defence industry. Obviously, some very massive, eye-wateringly large contracts that have been going to European companies as part of that, but also in infrastructure, where lots of European firms are involved in construction and running of public transport systems and so on. And the other one, very notable, is in the renewable energy sector, where wind, solar, gas, various other parts of that equation have been. We see lots of European companies in those fields. What's important to remember is that those companies come in and they need lots of companies in Australia to work with, because they're massive projects generally, great opportunities for Australian SMEs, but not only that. There are tremendous opportunities, and we see this quite frequently, where as a result of working with these European majors, Australian companies then become part of their global supply chain networks. And so a lot of Australian SMEs and others going into Europe or going into Asia in partnership with these large European firms that have entered the Australian market. So again, lots of good opportunities where there's that strategic alignment.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jason. I think that defence sector analogy around your primes and second and third tier suppliers is a great example of how Australian SMEs who've got excellent expertise in certain niche product that can actually tap into those global supply chains. I wanted to ask you, Jason, just before we wrap up, I know that the Chamber's doing a lot of great things. There's so many things that with the free trade agreement. What events do you have coming up around that we can get involved with and we can tell Australian businesses to get along to and learn more about EU and the opportunities for both bilateral trade and investment?
Sure. Look, there are lots of activities that are happening all around Australia, pretty much all the time. There's a very extensive network of European chambers of commerce that focus on the individual or bilateral, if you like, relationships between Australia and the individual countries in Europe, whether it be from Sweden to Portugal to Poland. And the British Chamber you mentioned just earlier, which is incredibly active. So that's at the bilateral level. There's us, which work at a pan-European level, working closely with each of those chambers. And then there are a number of special events that occur from time to time. And in particular, I'd like to point out the West Australian European Business Association in Perth that will be hosting a European Australian Business Week in Perth during the week of 16th of March, so just around the corner. That's going to be looking at all kinds of sectors, defence we've already mentioned, but also construction, in services, in technology. One of the things that is very exciting about Europe and Australia working together is in the space sector. Many people wouldn't be aware, but European space capability has been helping Australia during the floods and the bushfires through their global Earth observation systems. There's a deep space telescope project, which is European-led, but will also have major involvement in South Australia and Western Australia. So on that high-tech technology aspect, there's incredible fertile ground for Australia and Europe to be working together.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jason. We definitely want to encourage people, even from the East Coast, to get along to that European Business Week over in WA in March. I'm looking forward to being part of that with Mary over there, Mary Jardine Clark, and I know it's going to be an amazing week of events and contacts and opportunities. So definitely thank you so much, Jason, for joining us from Sydney. We definitely want to touch base with you and hopefully you can be one of our regulars so that we can keep updated over the months, over the years, about how things are going with the EU and Australia. So thanks again, Jason, and appreciate your time and look forward to speaking again very soon.
Very happy to, and see you in Perth.
Great, likewise. Thanks, Jason. Take care.